Welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream of the SNOMED CT Expo 2023. My name is Kai Keeley, and I'm the Technical Implementation Support Specialist at SNOMED International. I'll be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions. I'm now pleased to introduce Reuben Daniels from Saludax, who will be presenting the Queensland Clinical Terminology Service. Reuben, please go ahead.
All right, I'll pick up where I left off. No worries. So, as I was saying, thanks to SNOMED International for allowing me to present this material today and also for sequencing the previous presentation prior to me. I'm very pleased to say, Eric, that your presentation agrees completely with mine, so thank you for that. All right, let's get started. So not going to spend a lot of time on this because I hate talking about myself, but one key note for you is to please, if you're interested in anything I'm going to present or any of the various roles I have, note my email address. I'm always happy to take emails from anyone. This content tends to be fairly technical in some parts, and I'm very happy to take questions at the end and also post this presentation via email. Amongst my roles, these are the ones that I think are really quite relevant to this presentation. So I'm a Deputy FRI Product Director in HL7 International, and I co-chair the terminology groups in HL7 International. And within Queensland Health, I am the Application Manager for the Queensland Clinical Terminology Service and also its lead architect. So this is what I hope to cover today. I'll give you a bit of background on Queensland Health as an organization. We'll touch on what the HL7 FI terminology module is, and also what the National Clinical Terminology Service is, which is a dependency for the QCTS. I'll then talk briefly about the problem statement that led to the creation of the QCTS. Everything okay there? Okay. The objectives and a description, including how its components support the use of SNOMED CT. And then at the end, we'll deal with outcomes and the future of the QCTS and Q&A at the end. So in terms of background, Queensland Health, firstly, the state of Queensland is one of the 6 states of Australia. And in Australia, the states have complete control over delivery of healthcare services. We do have a federal Department of Health, which tends to deal more with policy and managing pandemics and so forth. So it is a self-contained health system in and of itself. Within Queensland Health, we've been a very staunch supporter of SNOMED CT for many years. I guess at the government level, Queensland Health is one of the funders of the Australian NRC, the Australian Digital Health Agency, and we also invest in the Australian eHealth Research Centre at the CSIRO, which many of you will know produce some wonderful terminology tools and have many experts, one of which is sitting right at the back in Dion McMurtry. Further to that, SNOMED CT, or at least the Australian edition, is adopted in our statewide enterprise clinical applications, including our Cerner-based statewide electronic medical record. We have a SNOMED namespace identifier, which we use for issuing medicines concepts for those medicines which do not have concepts in the Australian medicines terminology. And we also maintain a number of reference sets within the Australian edition as well to support things like allied health and real-time prescription monitoring. Just briefly on FHIR now, I'm sure none of you need to be told what FHIR itself is. What I'd like to tell you is that within the FHIR standard sits a terminology module, which includes everything in FHIR related to the use of terminology, including representing, communicating, and using it meaningfully. In amongst the composition of that module are documentation for the use of codes in FHIR, things like the coding, code, and codable concept data type. There are content like value sets, which may be used for binding, We have coded data types, resource types, and operations like value set expansions, and the fire terminology service, which I'll focus on a bit more on the next slide. The fire terminology service is a technical specification of a server application, which allows healthcare client applications to meaningfully use technology through a combination of the operations, the resource types, and further documentation. It defines a single API for applications to use for any terminology, and I think the previous presentation beautifully summarized how that works. There's a single fire API which can support exposure and access to multiple terminologies at the back end. And through that mechanism, the complexities of terminologies may thus be delegated to the fire terminology service implementation, like Snowstorm or the CSIRO's onto server, and I think there might be a few others out there as well. All right, moving on. Now, in Australia, we are extremely lucky to have a National Clinical Terminology Service, which is a service of the Australian Digital Health Agency, provided and operated by the CSIRO. It's a foundation digital health service provided by the NRC, and what it provides is a website for users to register for access to download documentation or indeed terminology releases. It provides content, including obviously the Australian edition. It provides technical specifications which profile the fire terminology module capabilities and defines a syndication API, which I touched on earlier on. It also provides servers, the National Syndication Server and the National Terminology Server, which expose those syndication and fire APIs for access and distribution of terminology. And it also provides a very simplified pathway for licensing of content and terminology applications, many provided by the CSIRO as well. This is, I guess in terms of full disclosure, I will admit that I was a part of this project when it first began. Sadly, I wasn't there when it went into production, but it is truly one of the jewels in the Australian National Digital Health Services crown. Right, now focusing on the QCTS itself. This is the problem statement. So Queensland Health as a major health system has many challenges when it comes to terminology, and these are a few that really led to the creation of the QCTS. Firstly, we really lacked a means for applications to consistently use the mandated terminologies. This was a capability gap, so we actually mandate the medicines terminology and SNOMED CTIU for use in our enterprise applications. And what we were finding is that every vendor had a different way of doing it. And because these approaches were not consistent, they led to confusion and in fact, some very bad implementations as well. Yeah, I guess that led to the complex and fragmented solutions, which we're trying to avoid because this was becoming a really major obstacle to interoperability, both within Queensland Health and more broadly. We had non-scalable terminologies, which led to duplicated effort across different parts of Queensland Health. So our system is obviously segmented into various health services and divisions of a Department of Health. Everyone had a different non-scalable approach. And further to that, due to their complexity, terminologies like SNOMED and LOINC were really not being maximized for things like decision support and analytics and so forth. So really, we had to look at all these problems. We looked at what standards were available, and we looked at the NCTS, and I guess this really was the justification for pursuing a statewide terminology service. So in doing so, we looked at what our objectives would be. The first one is very, very key, and I think touched on again in the last presentation. We want required terminology content to always be available, accessible, and effectively governed. I think in fact, at one point, we actually found that we didn't have the right licenses. People were using versions of SNOMED, which they really shouldn't be using from years ago. Part of the reason was that things weren't available and people just didn't know where to go to get anything. We wanted consistent and meaningful use of terminology content and standards. We wanted to increase sharing, reuse, and collaboration in the creation, use, and management of terminology content. We wanted to maximize the use of SNOMED, CT, LOINC, and similar terminologies. We wanted improved semantic interoperability, decision support, and analytics solutions. And we wanted the terminology needs of emerging solutions based on FHIR to be effectively addressed. I want to pause on that point. If anyone here has developed a FHIR implementation guide, you will no doubt realize that in order to make the standard work, implementation guide authors need to create lots of value sets and bind them to data elements which can carry a coded value. it's a very difficult prospect to deploy solutions with those requirements if you do not have a fire terminology server. And ideally, that would be part of a terminology service. So realizing that, we made that one of the objectives of the QCTS as well. So what is the QCTS? In simple terms, it's a statewide business service providing access to up-to-date terminology content and enabling Queensland Health staff and applications to meaningfully use this content. The key components of the QCTS, and I guess this is my one takeaway slide if you leave with anything, please note the following key things. You need the ICT solution. I think that's kind of obvious. Terminology servers, websites, things of that sort, and I'll get into the details of those in a moment. But perhaps less obvious is you need very strong policies, standards, and specifications, which ensures that you've got a shared understanding of everything. And finally, you need effective governance arrangements. Oops, did I do that? Okay, great. I'm going to touch on each of those three areas in the next few slides. So on the ICT solution, we've got a number of clear foundations here, starting on the left with terminology, interoperability, and security standards. The QCTS is very proudly highly standards-based. Amongst those standards, obviously SNOMED CT, LOINC as content standards, and FHIR are for APIs. We also base our syndication API on Atom, and API security is based on OAuth 2. On the application side, again, we are so privileged in Queensland to have access to all these wonderful CSIRO terminology applications. First and foremost, obviously, the Onto server terminology server, coupled with Onto Command for providing a web-based interface to manage Onto server. We also have Atomio deployed as a syndication server, the Shrimp terminology browser, and the Snapper authoring platform to author FHIR resources. And then, of course, we leverage the NCTS very strongly, and that's used to obtain content releases like SNOMED CTAU and LOINC, as well as nationally relevant FHIR resources, and of course, all those specifications from the NCTS, specifically those for syndication and FHIR. In terms of what the ICT solution is then composed of, first and foremost, it is fully cloud-hosted. For content or whatever, to register, browse terminology, download terminology, and author terminology or related content like concept maps and so forth. There is a source of truth terminology content repository provided, and this holds instances of SNOMED CTAU, LOINC, FHIR code system value set, and concept map resources. So it's all in one place and readily available, accessible from the website. And we also provide a highly scalable terminology server and as a load balanced array of Onto server instances optimized for high loads, and that provides access to terminology content by integrated applications. And last but not least, the QCTS provides two key APIs, a FHIR API, which exposes operations like expansion, translate, and so forth, as well as the syndication, which are based on the Atom standard. So these allow integrated solutions to do pretty much whatever they need to do, whether it's getting access to content releases in their native forms or onto server binary index forms or FHIR resources, or if not that, then to actually simply use the content for whatever it is they need to use it for. Right, the second key building block, policies, standards, and specifications. So these are Queensland Health and some external artifacts which ensure a shared understanding, adoption, and implementation of terminology. Some of the, in amongst the Queensland Health artifacts examples, they have policies and standards for content. We've got a FHIR content type specification, which actually further profiles the NCTS profiles of the FHIR terminology resource types so that they're more specifically attuned for Queensland Health-based content. Not too many changes, fixing certain values like email addresses and providing conventions for versioning and titles and names and so forth, URIs indeed. We also provide guidelines for the use of clinical terminologies, and we provide technical specifications for creation and integration of applications. Some of the external artifacts include the NCTS technical specifications and policies, and of course the SNOMED International URI standard. Lastly, in the building blocks are governance arrangements. So within Queensland Health, we have a dedicated Queensland Health team. They're actually called Health Informatics Services. and they are the QCTS service provider and responsible for its ongoing operation and governance. We've also assigned data and application managers as well as custodians for the QCTS who take on very strong governance roles. And for the day-to-day, we have QCTS administrators assigned with responsibilities for management and operation of the ICT solution, developing, maintaining, adopting QCTS policies, standards, and specifications. And I will add that part of that includes consultation with the broader health system. We don't just create things on our own and throw them over the fence. We liaise with strategic partners like the Australian Digital Health Agency and the CSIRO. And lastly, we ensure that the QCTS will continue to evolve and meet our changing needs. So these governance arrangements are really what keep the QCTS relevant for what our stakeholders need now and into the future. Right, here's my slide for SNOMED International. This is how the QCTS supports the use of SNOMED CT. Within the ICT solution, SNOMED CT terminologies are very broadly supported as a content type. We actually went quite out of our way to make sure that not just the Australian edition was supported, but also the international edition on the APIs as well as for syndication. Should we ever need to, we don't actually host the international edition at this time, but certainly we'll be, should the needs ever arise, that or indeed the IPS terminology and so forth will be supported out the box. We also keep all available SNOMED CT releases and their corresponding reference sets such that they can be browsed, they can be used in the authoring of FHIR resources, they can be downloaded from the website or via the syndication API, and they can be accessed for use via the FHIR-based integration API. QCTS users may also lodge QCTS requests for changes to SNOMED CTAU through the request management solution. On the policy, standards, and specifications side, as I mentioned, we mandate the use of SNOMED CTAU and the AMT across our solutions, and we provide guidance for SNOMED CT in solutions and specifications. On the governance arrangement side, the QCTS team have sole responsibility for all licensing arrangements, as well as Queensland Health participation as a user of the NCTS. Management of SNOMED CT content requests are all centralized in the QCTS team, all of those being bound for the Australian NRC so that we don't have the whole health system going to the NRC. And we also provide use and management of the Queensland Health SNOMED CT namespace identifier. In terms of outcomes, we've been in production just over 2 years now. We went live on the 31st of August of 21. At the moment, we have over 130 users. QCTS is broadly considered to be a very reliable solution as well as a key enabler. Development of FHIR terminology resources for Queensland Health has now commenced. Before, most of these, we have many code systems simply in paper or PDF specifications. They are now being realized as FHIR code system resources, and that's an ongoing effort, and we hope to see really good coverage of our health systems, code systems very shortly. And what we've also found is that other parts of Queensland Health who are developing common services based on FHIR, be they for consent management providers, organizations seeking to use FHIR APIs, they are now looking at the QCTS and its architectural and governance approaches as being a really good model and foundation to follow for future FHIR-based common services, which we welcome very, very much. Looking at the future, we've been providing lots of advice to other Australian states and territories seeking to develop their own NCTS-aligned terminology service solutions. And I extend an invitation to anyone here who's interested in speaking to the team or myself about if you're thinking about doing a terminology service similar to this, we'd be very happy to talk to you. We're also supporting participation in national FHIR initiatives in Australia, like the Spark FHIR Accelerator, and the enhancements we're looking at the moment for the ICT solution, including support for new terminologies, addition of new web-based terminology applications, and supporting future versions of the FHIR standard. Great, that's my presentation, and I welcome any questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Reuben. Yeah, if we've got any questions in the room, please step up to the microphone.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. Quick question on the issue of mandates. You mentioned that you mandate the use of terminologies in your solutions. Could you tell us a bit about your compliance mechanism for that?
Certainly. I'll start with the instrument, or instruments, I should say. As I mentioned, Queensland Health is separated into a Department of Health, which has a number of divisions, and then the hospitals and health services themselves are 16 separate organizations named Hospital and Health Services. So we've got some policies apply to those health services and some to the department. So within the health services, we have the Enterprise Architecture Health Service Directive, and that's what mandates the use of SNOMED, CT, and AU in those solutions. It's a very similar mandate in the Department of Health's Enterprise Architecture Policy. Now, in terms of compliance, we are quite strict on architectural governance in Queensland Health. If anyone is trying to develop or deploy a new solution in Queensland Health, they need to author a solution architecture document, and that's usually carried out by the solution architect or architects in a project team. And that architecture, once written, defined, needs to undergo architectural governance. We have an architectural and standards committee, which reviews those solution architectures. And if there's any hint that they're using SNOMED, or not using SNOMED, I should say, that we will certainly be then asking the project team to justify that decision. And from there, they have two pathways. They can change their mind and actually use it. Or they can make a case under a dispensation policy for permission to not use it. And indeed, there are a few valid reasons for them not to use it. But generally, we can usually find a way for them to use it in one way or the other. And that's how the compliance is ensured. It's not a perfect system. Certainly, not every project is eligible to go through that architecture and standards process. It's usually projects that are in excess of 500,000 Australian dollars, or affect multiple hospital and health services. But for the most part, we have pretty good coverage, especially when it comes to medicines. The fact is there just isn't anything better than the AMT out there at the moment, and that's something fortunately most vendors have come to realize. I hope that answers well enough. Sure.
Reuben, in another meeting, you tempted me.
Oh, I did?
That you were going to talk a little bit about the connection of Queensland to your new owner of your EHR, in other words, Oracle.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that without
certainly
exposing everything?
No, I've exposed them all over the place. Right, so again, just a touch of background here. I think about a decade ago now, Dion might know more about this history. Queensland Health embarked on a statewide EHR for the state. The choice was Cerner Millennium and a bunch of the Cerner Millennium related applications. And that was going to production. The mandate for SNOMED CT applied back then, and it applied to them. And they graciously did adopt SNOMED CT-AU in the EHR deployed for Queensland Health. It's done in a way which to me still sounds like voodoo magic, but it does involve sending the Australian edition to Kansas, and it coming back in some form that can be used as part of the EHR. Certainly, for many years, the CSIRO and Queensland Health have been very keen for back then Cerner, now Oracle Health, to start looking at adopting FHIR APIs for access to terminology. We'd love to maintain some of the sets of concepts as value sets and for them to be updated independently of the way they get done at the moment. To date, that has not been taken up, I should say, that the challenge. I haven't had many direct conversations with Oracle Health. I've had many with Cerner itself. And I can appreciate the difficulty. It's a very complex system. Many systems use terminology, and it's obviously set up to support them in one way. And changing it wholesale would be a pretty big undertaking. But nonetheless, the need only continues to grow as far as Queensland Health is concerned. More especially now that we actually have a terminology server. It's not as if we're asking them to provide one. So we'll continue with those discussions. And I guess in the interim, we'd be looking at smart on FHIR applications, which can actually use a terminology server embedded in Cerner. Happy to keep you posted, Charles.
All right, I think we'll wrap that up. Thanks again, Reuben. Thanks for your talk.
Thank you all.